Friday, everybody. Please join me in welcoming Benjamin Patton, grandson of the legendary World War II General George S. Patton Jr. and son of Major General George Patton IV. Ben's a filmmaker, author of the book Growing Up Patton, and founder of the Patton Veterans Project. Through his I Was There filmmaking workshops, he's helped over 1,500 veterans process trauma, reduce isolation, rediscover purpose, and successfully transition to civilian life. With a master's in developmental psychology and deep roots in military families, Ben brings powerful insights from his family legacy and his own work supporting those leaving service. Ben, thank you and welcome today. Appreciate you
Pleasure to
taking the
be
time to
here.
come out and chat.
Pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm excited to talk to everybody, and it sounds like we got a pretty cool audience that are gonna ask some tough questions. That's always good.
Yeah,
So yes.
oh, cool. Did you want to start off with that first video, or do you want to
Well,
segue
I mean,
into it?
sure. I can give you a little background. Or maybe I should give just a stencil out what I do.
Yeah, go
Um,
ahead.
um, so for about 15 years, you might my career may be charitably called fluid, but by the time I got to 30, I got into film and music and marketing. I worked for the company that invented the jingle uh, for Nickelodeon. And the nick do do do, and we made hundreds of others, and that was kind of fun. But anyway, I just a brief, like in 2 minutes, I got into this area because I started around early in the Iraq Afghanistan wars. I'd always wanted to teach, and I'd always wanted to teach film and teach kids. So I started a summer camp with another friend who was kind of a blinking genius, educator and media expert. And we were running 2-week film camps for teenagers in Massachusetts and in Colorado on farms. And very quickly, what we started to see was that the kids, like 13 to 19, were making films about identity, adolescent identity. We've all been through it. Your first pimple, Mean Girls, getting picked on, all those kinds of things, your first kiss. And so they were making films about that, all kinds of cool films. And I started to wonder, my father's command chopper pilot in Vietnam said, this might help some of the vets at the Soldier Family Assistance Centers and the WTUs process things as they're getting out. So we got an invitation to a base at Fort Carson, and one thing led to another, and we ended up at about 10 or 15 bases. We evolved to VAs, and then we evolved to community colleges and universities because they're much less stigmatized. So the way it works, and then I'll show the film, is 15 or 20 vets come together in a room, and you're surrounded by five really talented filmmakers, and we bring all the equipment and pretty compact but very good equipment, and we teach them about film. Why do we tell stories? And I don't know if this is interactive, but I certainly can. Is that Ernie? Is there any? Can I ask questions, or should I just
Yeah,
do my thing for a
please
while?
do.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
let's go into
absolutely.
that. Tell me why. Give me some examples of why we tell stories. Just jump in, unmute and jump in.
Ben, go.
Me- Heck yeah. Well, so stories for me, oftentimes it's a testimony of my life and the things that I have found to be true. The other one is make people laugh, have some fun with that. And it's historically the best way to tell history, the best way to be able
That's
to
true.
pass down how you keep hold of things, which I saw an
That's
interesting
true.
study that's why women last longer than men do because they have better memories
That makes
and they
sense. Well,
actually can carry on.
yeah, as kids, we were always encouraged to read biography. It gives you history from a point of view. Any others? I can give you a few. Give me one other. Anybody?
Kevin.
If you're sitting in the back, I'm going to call on you,
Work
You're all
on
the way
trauma.
down.
I think that for me, telling stories, along with what Ben said, but it's shared experiences. So sometimes it makes you when you are listening to other people's stories or you're telling your own story. A lot of times we're all kind of feeling isolated, but when you tell those stories, you realize that hey, other people are going through these experiences too, so I'm not
Yep.
alone.
Yep, that's right. So a couple others, to teach, to learn, to remember. And one that I usually say when we do our film workshops, well, I'll tell you a little more about in a second, is to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, to make sense. And I'm not a veteran, but I have experienced trauma directly and indirectly, mostly indirectly. And it's to make sense of things that don't make sense a lot of times, putting back together your narrative or reconstructing it in a different way that fits whatever the next phase of your life is. And I'll just answer my own question is how we tell stories. Of course, there are many ways. Sculpture, theater, music, poetry, prose, Ours is video. And if you think about it, everybody here has a video camera in their pocket. And hopefully you're not texting on it right now, or I'll call on you for that too. But it's the most powerful, I would say, and ubiquitous communications device we've ever manufactured, mankind, we ever created. So that's the backdrop, and people come in and they learn about those things. We do some cool film exercises. Then we show a couple of clips of films, Forrest Gump, Parasite, Witness, things like that. Break them down, and then we throw a bunch of ideas up on the board. This is where it gets very private and confidential. It could be anything. It could be suicide, MST, why I love the Army, why I hate the Navy. Of course, I'm a Patton, so I say that. But no, it could be the other way too. But it's just ingrained, I keep pro Army. But so that's what happens. And then we distill those down to 4 or 5 ideas. The veterans choose which one they're going to be involved in, and they maybe they want to be behind the camera, don't want to be behind the camera, want to be on film. And so we're really the banks of the river, and they're the ones that decide every aspect creatively what this is. And it's not documentary. What's so interesting, and this will be the ground work for the foundation for having you watch one of these films, which is pretty relevant to everyone in this podcast, I think. And so, it's a way to collaborate. You cannot make a film by yourself, really. You've got to have somebody holding the camera online, on the camera. They're different roles, so it's inherently collaborative. And what happens is people come in like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know about this Patton guy or all these civilians. About a third of my instructors are vets, and they come out of it new friends. They don't care what your gender is or your sexual preference or anything else, whether you're a civilian or not. They just go, wow, that person really got my story. And the key is that we put a piece in of each person. It has to be in the story. So with that as a backdrop, I'd love for you to watch this film. Very simple, conceived in maybe a couple of hours, shot and edited with the help of a professional film instructor. One of my instructors that I had for years, now he's too famous to work for me, won an Oscar this past year, a year ago, for a film called War is Over, which I think you can find on YouTube. And it's lovely. It's about the end of World War One, animation. So take a look at this and just imagine that 3 or 4 people are making this film that have never met before. And a couple days later, they're good friends. So if you want to show maybe this time, Ernie, that would be great.
Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
It's about 3 minutes long. I don't see it. Do you guys see it?
Yeah. You got to come up with a second screen.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, I've seen it 1,000 times.
I got called in on my day off. Go see this patient. He's been in like 4 times this week. Yeah. All right, later. Steve Smith.
Well, maybe this time. Maybe this time.
Good morning.
For the last 2 weeks, have you been feeling any of the following? Feeling down, depressed, or hopeless?
Yes, still.
Feeling tired or having little energy?
Yes, still.
Thoughts that you would be better off dead or of hurting yourself?
Yeah, hold on a minute. We go through this every time I come in here. This is the 4th time I've been in here this week. We always start with this checklist. A 20-minute appointment here, right? And we piss away 10 minutes of it asking the same stupid questions. Yes, it's been in the last 2 weeks. I was just here yesterday. I think at this point, you just need to see what I see. You need to look at it through my eyes, and maybe you'll understand.
Steve, I see now. I can't help you, but I know someone on my team that can.
Okay. All right, let's do this. Thanks.
Steve, good luck to you.
All right, thanks, Doc.
See you next week.
Absolutely. Thanks
All right.
again.
Katie Jones. Do you mind if I see your glasses?
Maybe this time.
Well, you're muted, Ben.
Oh, sorry. I'd love for anyone's reactions to that. Did it resonate with any of you? Have you had that kind of experience? Do you have the stigma, that some of these people tend to have? Like it's not cool to go get help and things like that.
Hey, Ben, go ahead.
So,
Yeah, that's why in the comments I said this must be a flight doc, because anytime that I've been in the military, on a military base, dealing with a military flight doctor or a psychiatrist, if they can't fix you within like a week, maybe 2 weeks, it's like, oh, well, you're either full of shit or cool. Well, you're not going to blow your head off tonight. All right, go back to work. Right? It's a triage for them. It's a spit it in, spit it out. Nobody gives a shit about you. Is a lot of what that is. The only time I've gotten to someone who actually seems to give a shit was through Wounded Warrior Project and someone off base, and it resonated when I tell her, hey, this is what I'm thinking about. This is what's going on, because the look on her face was just like, holy cats, what? Instead of okay, yeah, all right, yeah, okay. And then the funny part too sucks is it's like, oh, I haven't seen you in 3 months, but tell me what happened last week.
right.
Anyway, that's
Yeah.
me.
Anyone else? I see a few hands raised. That's great.
Yeah, go ahead, William.
It resonated a lot actually. The issue I had typically was trying to be fit into a box. Most of them come in with a plan to make you fit into something, and I think we're all so different. We all have so many different experiences, and they're not listening. They're not listening. They're asking questions to fit you into their specific treatment plan so that they can justify their existence. And that's what I've run into. And I've seen a lot of them from before I got out till after I got out with the VA. The VA might actually be, for me, has been the worst. But I would say take advantage to everybody out here. Take advantage of the people that you have right now, because it gets worse on the VA side. So yeah, that is very fitting.
I've worked with about 5 VAs, and I must say, people always say that your experience at one VA is the experience of one VA. I mean, I think there's several that are good, some that aren't as good. I mean, a lot of them are veterans. I have one wonderful one, which is similar to that, except the guy turns out to be a veteran. And so, the thing about film, though, well, so for that one, you can guess who the audience, probably the audience is the VA. The audience is soldiers that are, or, servicemen and women that are dealing with that stigma. But I also think another audience, and I'm going to show you another film in a minute. Another audience are the loved ones, the family, the friends, that kind of thing. Because look, it's a strange. I'm working on a book. I'm not really a writer, although I wrote one book. I guess I'm a writer. I wrote one book about my dad, which I commend to you. It's called Growing Up Patton. The book was out 12, 13 years ago, but actually the cool thing, and I don't think I even told Ernie this, is the audiobook that I just recorded in the fall. And it's got my dad's voice, some of his best speeches at the end. It's got audio correspondence over the course of a year between my parents in 1968. So it's pretty cool. But anyway, what I found though, the book I'm running on now is about how issues of communication, healthcare, and transportation, and weaponry, and all that stuff, how we track those over all the major conflicts since over the course of our country. And what I found though is that there used to be a very close, partly geographically because of the geographics, but there used to be a much closer bond between family and veterans and servicemen. Now there's just, we're not in World War One or World War Two where there was kind of a binding together, particularly World War Two, of the whole country was in sort of an existential battle against the Germans and the Japanese. But as we've grown, and this is again, I'm speaking as a civilian who's been around the military my whole life, but what I found is in the more recent conflicts in the war on terror, there just is, it's not so much, nobody's spitting on veterans like they were in Vietnam, but there's an ambivalence, there's an ignorance, and there's just like people are doing other stuff. And so this kind of film, I think, brings people together in a different way because film is really what we call an empathy machine. It really, you can put literally in that film, you can put yourself and you do put yourself in a person's shoes, see what they've experienced. And it doesn't solve all the problems, but it's a step in the right direction because I'm working on a documentary, it's my other life, on Ukraine. I was just in Ukraine 2 weeks ago, and I think Ernie has a couple things. I wrote an article that ended up in a bunch of Ukrainian papers, and I did an interview with the London Times yesterday. It's all on Substack as well. And and so, this in Ukraine and to some extent in Israel, the trauma is indiscriminate, so the Ukrainians are all dealing with it. And we're going to go over and do some workshops there, maybe not with veterans right away because they're all on the front, but with the civilians, and the trauma that they're experiencing directly and indirectly. So it's really a wonderful way to help educate and engage the civilians because people getting out of the military, particularly suicide and things like that, people are most at risk for suicide the closer to when they get out, actually. And the suicide rate is going up under 30. I wonder, here's a little trivia question, but people don't really think about, you probably know in a broad sense, but we lost about 7,000, KIAs in the war on terror. And during that same period, we lost 140,000 to suicide. So this is an astounding thing. It's about 17 a day. People say 22, but it's still very high. It's 17. And so again, this is a way to bind, to help create a fabric the way Ukraine has, and a fabric of support underneath the veterans' experience. And I think these films, that's just as important, I think, as helping the individual soldier. So if there are any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. Or maybe you disagree. I'm happy to for people to disagree.
Yeah, Marcus, you had was that a previous question, or are you good?
Oh, it was a previous question because I
Go
was
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
because when I was watching the film, the one thing that really stood out to me was the lack of empathy that the advisor had, and him just going through the. It was just him going through the motions. So, and I feel like a lot of people have seen that a lot of the times too, where they just walk in and they just, you know, go through the motions. Yeah, yeah, okay, push them off to the next thing.
Well, that is true among individual VAs. I think, but statistically, believe it or not, you are much better off in VA care than not in VA care, in the broad sense. There's some crappy VAs and you read them about them on 60 Minutes sometimes, but by and large, statistically, you are better off without care. There's an interesting study but that's a perfectly valid viewpoint. The other thing, when you have a company essentially 400,000 people. I'm not making excuses for them, but geez, that's a lot of people to kind of quality control. But there's an interesting study that came out a few years ago, and they interviewed about 1,000 people. I think most of them were vets that were not enrolled in any kind of care, VA or other mental health care, and had attempted suicide to complete suicide unsuccessfully. So one of the questions they asked him was, well, why didn't you seek care? Why didn't you want care or try to get help from the VA? And 8 out of 10 of them answered, well, why would I do that? I didn't need help. I was doing fine, which is kind of crazy. But any other thoughts on either on the film or what I just spoke about?
Hey, William, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so this is I'm pretty passionate about this one, so you might get some hard love on it. So first of all, thank you for bringing this kind of thing up. I think it's great, but I am not a slacker when it comes to crushing the VA. If you tell me one VA is good and another one's bad, that's a problem with the VA. It should
It
be across
certainly
the
is.
board. Everybody in here, in every spot they're in, they should be held, they should be expected to get that same level of care, and they don't. They don't pay them enough, the counselors and the professional psychs that are in there. And if they're not paid enough, they don't get the care they want. You tell these stories and you tell about the people that they've interviewed and stuff. I know for a fact, not people who just served, but people who were on the front line their entire time who just walked out because they couldn't take it anymore. And you know what their answer is? Met them up, fill them up with drugs,
Well,
put
that
them
is
in that
true.
state. And then
That's
what
true.
do? They go into the drugs, they drink, and then they what? Go back in for help? No, they've already had it fail on them. So if you tell me one VA hospital isn't up to par, I got a problem with it because that means
Well,
somebody's going in there getting help and not getting what they need. So, and it's
I
not on
totally
you.
agree.
I'm just
I
fired
totally
up
agree.
about it because I've lost too many people to suicide because they weren't taken care of. No one cared enough. So that's
No,
it.
I
That's a
totally agree. I'm not going to make excuses for the VA. I mean, it took 2 years to pay us for a contract we had, that I got like 2 weeks ago. But I do have a friend who was with the 82nd Airborne, came in with Tommy Franks and fought in the first Battle of Fallujah. And since then, he came back transformed. He stopped drinking, got a master's degree, went to work for the VA. Now he's one of the senior people involved of oversight for the vet centers, and he has lost 43 people to suicide in his battalion. So there are good forces out there, but they're so disincentivized. And his wife actually is a clinician, and when Elon Musk got involved, they made them go into the office. I think all 5 days actually, most of the people, and then they didn't really plan that out, so they didn't have enough office space. So it is what it is, and I think telemed can work at least as a step. But anyway, totally agree. That's why we're doing what we do. We should be 10 times bigger than we are, but we have about 400 films. We've worked with nearly 2,000 vets. We have now a situation, since we do have a small contract with the VA, to be able to follow up with them over at least over several months, because I don't claim to be a PTSD reducer. What we are is a gateway that changes someone's attitude, not necessarily toward the VA, but toward care at least. And we mainly have been working, and you guys are welcome. We're not doing we do them once or twice a month, mainly in high suicide areas such as the Rockies and Oregon we're working on now. And we're going to hopefully go to Alaska soon. We're going to work in Ukraine. We're working in Israel a bit. So, because those are where the at-risk folks are in a high concentration, and just in the Rockies alone, there's 60,000 that fit that are not enrolled in any sort of mental health care, civilian or military, and have post-traumatic stress. I don't usually use the D, but I have post-traumatic stress, and so we literally are helping with that, and it just changes their attitude. And we did a clinical study that showed with the VA that showed that of veterans that fit that description, 8 out of 10 of them took an appointment within a couple of months. Now, whether they kept on with it, I'm not sure because we don't have the resource to follow up with everybody forever. But anyway, it's just, I'm very aware of that issue, which is exactly why we made that film, or why the veterans wanted to make that film. So, I want to show you, I can go back and we can talk a little about Patton too. That's always fun. Some of the stories I grew up with. By the way, yeah, if you're interested, you can subscribe to the Substack. You can go up on our website, pattonvets.org, and subscribe to our little newsletter that comes out once every 2 weeks. And I hate the word newsletter because it's called the Nickel, and which is 5 minutes of inspiration. So it's one story usually. And the reason I came, okay, here's a trivia question for World War II buffs that know anything about Patton. What's the word nickel come from? Besides being my next dog that my wife won't let me get. Well, I'll tell you, because probably people don't know. It's the password he used when Eisenhower gave him permission to go pivot 90 degrees and go up to Bastogne. He had several code words, lucky and nickel and one other, and he just went into the phone. He already had it lined up, depending on which way Eisenhower wanted to go. So that gave me the inspiration for that. And then I'm on LinkedIn. I put out a professional post about every 2 or 3 days about family, about leadership, and about our work. So if we can ask more questions at the end, but I want to show you one more film that's not about the VA, but a big issue is suicide. And it's interesting because again, this is just the experience of somebody who's been around it. I mean, I grew up on military history and, Kellogg's cornflakes every morning, so that's just the way it is. It doesn't make me an expert. It just makes me, and I do have a background in psychology, but it just makes me a caring guy who's pretty smart and pays attention, and wants to. And the only reason I'm doing this is to help vets. But anyway, so this next film deals with suicide. And I think at least three people in the film, one guy's not on camera, but at least three people in the film have had at least suicidal ideation. I think one of them attempted suicide unsuccessfully. But yet it's a non-stigmatizing, accessible, I think largely very understandable film about it. We've had other ones we had one guy make a comedy called So You Want to Kill Yourself. It's actually hilarious, but could only be made by somebody who had suicidal ideation. And it's hard to explain. I rarely show it. I made it at a VA, and the head of the VA came in, and he was like, "Dude, I don't know about this one." And then it turned out to be one he liked. So he's almost going to lock me in a closet. And then he said, "It's actually pretty good." So check this film out. It's called The Hand You're Dealt. It was made about 6 months ago. And
Right on. Well, I'm glad everybody's here. I hope you're all excited to play some spades because I ain't played spades in a grip. Tina, I hope you're on the game.
Yeah.
Just so you know, these two look like a couple of beasts over here.
Yeah, I mean, we do what we can do.
Yeah. So I'm excited. I'm stoked. Hope you guys are all ready.
Yeah.
All right. Let's play some spades.
Remember, guys, you got to play the hand you're dealt.
When I was active duty in the Army, I broke my back on a jump. Wow.
Damn, I didn't know that.
It was rough. Got hurt.
I got a drinking problem when I got out. I can relate a little bit to that.
I get it.
Yeah, guys, I got into drugs really bad. Damn, sis.
Shit, you ever been homeless?
Damn, man, no. Ooh, that's hard.
And I'm broke.
Yeah, damn.
Yep. This time, I'm gonna have to go ahead and play car repo. That's been a tough one. My whole family, we were moving into the car, and the car got repoed. That was tough.
Shit, my house is in foreclosure.
Oh my God. Been there.
I cleaned up and I got a new job.
All right. Yeah, my partner. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay. Congratulations. That job I just got, debt-free now.
Yes, my partner. I've been doing some vocational rehab. Oh, I'm so glad y'all busted out them spade cards, because look, I landed a kickflip.
What?
Yeah.
With your old ass?
You know it. I did it.
Oh, yeah.
Damn. Play to win, partner.
I still got hope.
You're muted, Ben.
let this one play out because there's some cool thing at the end in the credits. So keep it going. Keep going, keep going.
Looked like it ended. Or
Not over yet. Not over yet.
It already ended.
Oh, maybe it was a clipped video.
No clip, just keep it going.
Hmm.
How would I make a clip video? Come on. I
don't know, the
came
link,
to this
I don't-
prepared. What's that?
Yeah. Oh, maybe it's the link. I don't know.
Well, anyway, it's just a keep going.
That's it.
I'm sorry. I think, well, actually, I couldn't see it. Did you see the sort of yeah, maybe it was there. I'm sorry I wasn't watching it, but you saw the part where she walked out and threw the cards on the ground?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it was the whole thing. I'm sorry. I can't see it on my particular view. But I love that. I love when she just walks out and just like, "Pff, I'm done, with this, with being hard on myself." So I don't know. Once again, I'm not trying to say this solves problems, but it does open people up to the fact that, not just the film, but the fact they worked with, a veteran or a civilian instructor. They met three or four people. They're like, wow, maybe I should tell my ex-wife about, or, call up my kids that I haven't spoken to in years, or take those pills or whatever it is, just go to the SVAC. And it just tends to open people up to possibly looking at just taking control of their lives because, you can hold someone's hand for a long period of time, but there's a point at which to get to that next phase, somebody has to sort of take that step themselves. So tell me how you guys reacted to that. They both won kind of awards at some military festivals, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've all been exposed to, either ourselves or through colleagues, friends, family. And every
Yeah.
single person in here has had to bury a friend that, chose the suicide over hope.
Yep, that's
No
right.
doubt
And
there.
yeah. Um, Anyone else have any thoughts? Did you guys enjoy it? Think it was interesting, powerful?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Jennifer.
Yeah. So, as somebody who has tried to commit suicide and has overcome that, that was really powerful. So, I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
well, yeah, and the important thing about that one is that you don't have a military sense. They're not really talking about the military. And one of them, the Hispanic-looking woman who is with a slightly dark olive skin, was a spouse actually. She came because her husband, she was sort of his caregiver. But then they get in there and like, no, I'm going to make my own film, and he goes in a different group. And it's important because it's non-stigmatizing, and it also can be perfectly understood by a civilian. I mean, I am touched by suicide in that my son's mom, committed suicide, jumped out of her building, and she was a very highly tightly strung skin cancer surgeon, and she just it was long after we were not together, but it was tough. And my son was 9, and it was right down the street here. So I'm touched by it in that way. But trauma is really universal. It's not it's I mean I believe, like, I can't, in a certain sense, I can't relate to anything you all have been through, really, but I can just tell you that trauma feels the same. It's not the same, but it feels the same to me in many ways from what I observed and have learned about veterans. And it's not to say that I can put myself in your shoes, but the good thing about film also is that you don't have to have seen Patton to have an opinion about whether, or been in the military to have an opinion whether it was a good film or not. That's the thing. So that's why we call it kind of an empathy machine. And like I said, it helps you imagine, analogously, your own life in a story. And the good thing is, sometimes the films end positively, sometimes they end negatively. You can create a narrative that reflects what you've been through, or you can create the narrative that ends in the way that you'd like it to be, that you'd like your life to be, as a kind of a form of hope. And people do it for different reasons. There are different audiences. And if you're ever interested, right now we have a couple in Colorado coming up. And as soon as you get a lot more funding, I want to do it everywhere. And a personal goal, being a civilian, is to do this with civilians. Do this with, Newtown, Uvalde, Las Vegas, people like that. We're working with people in Israel that are more on the sort of the liberal progressive Burning Man meets Woodstock part of the population that were shot to hell in the October 7th raids, and we're at it like a big concert, and they just got a couple hundred of them got mowed down, and so they're particularly traumatized because these are people that for whatever reason do not associate with themselves with the military, and mostly women, because women aren't required to serve in the military in Israel. But anyway, so that's really that. I mean, we're hopeful to grow. We've been invited to come to Ukraine in the second half of the year. I'm doing a documentary on that right now. As I said, it's about Ukraine. It really focuses on one couple. The woman is making, it's all in this Substack article. They're making, she makes drones, and has a little home office with some volunteers, and they make 10 or 20 a day. and then the guy is, 300 miles away on the front, and it kind of follows them. But built around that is the whole amazing story of Ukraine and drones, and it's quite something. It's quite a persevering people, and that are binded together through this, this existential threat to their country, to the very, their very livelihood. And let me just tell you in one sentence, the Ukrainians are kicking some Russian ass right now. No matter what you read, we need them a hell of a lot more than they need us. I mean, they have a surplus of drones at a million made this year, and they're going to up it to 7 million next year. They're going to double the size of their military, and they're so good at it that all the Middle Eastern countries have asked them to help protect their refineries. And we haven't really, in a formal sense, you know, taking their help on. But if I were NATO, I'd drag them into NATO. But after what I've seen, it's the whole society is synchronized. I mean, you know exactly whether it was a successful mission or whether the guy was carrying a Kalashnikov or he was North Korean, every time they had a strike. And I flew a drone out of a pickup truck. So the other thing I would say is and I'm not trying to be political here, just based on my observations, which were different. I mean, I had different ideas before I got there. But the Iranians have plenty of drones. You never hear about the drones. You hear about us bombing 30,000 targets, but the minute we send a Marine ship down the strait, I think it's going to get taken apart like the charge of the Light Brigade. That's just me. But anyway, that's just an observation. We're in a new era of warfare and a different kind of PTSD. I've had a few drone pilots from the US that sit in a trailer during the day, or one guy that was an ICBM commander, a site commander, and they come home, they're essentially playing video games to a certain extent, the drone operators. They come home and then they play Halo with their kid. This is a very different but equally significant type of PTSD, and that's the next generation of post-traumatic stress, and also terrorism. I mean, somebody's going to sit at the end of DCA Airport in Washington and fire a drone and when the plane's taken off and run it up the back of a jet engine or something. So not to scare you guys, but what I loved about Ukraine is they were very much about, we want to help the world understand how to grapple with this technology and use it for good. So anyway, that's the end of my lecture on Patton Veterans Project in Ukraine. And if you don't have any other questions, you can ask questions. We can talk about my family,
Yeah,
which is always a fun story.
speaking of family, so like, obviously you didn't get to meet your grandfather, but sitting around the kitchen table eating cornflakes and war stories with dad, I can imagine that there's probably like some great stuff in there. So like, what's one family story that still shapes, how you see service today?
Well, I think in a way, when I got into the Naval Academy prep school, my grades were not very good, but I don't think they were going to not put me in a road to getting in. So, and it wasn't pressure from my dad. It took me a while to figure that out. He just wanted me to do what made me happy. And I think I liked flying. I was into flying. I was into naval. We're big sailors in my family, all that stuff. So it kind of was the right thing. I think when I got there, I just felt like if your name's Patton, you got to go in like an NFL linebacker. You can't go, let me try to stick my toe in the water. And I just never quite had that burning desire. And I was looking at school in 83. So this was pre-Persian Gulf and all that. But I would say, I mean, I have a couple stories I could tell you. Has anybody seen the movie Patton? I'm sure a number of you probably have.
It's been a while,
Okay.
but yeah, George C. Scott
Okay.
killed it.
Yeah, it came out when I was 5, and I vaguely remember being snuck into a movie theater when I was about 6 or 7 to see the movie. And nobody's around that was there, so they can't tell me for sure. But I remember going in there and watching my dad sniffle, when he saw certain things. That's about as emotional as he got in that situation. But basically, I'll tell you a couple things. I'll tell you a little bit of how my dad uh, made it through the military, and a couple examples of, if that's okay, of how the leadership qualities of my grandfather translated and the ones my dad developed. So, first of all, my grandfather was incredibly famous. He got in harm's way quite a bit, highly decorated. I would say fearless, but my dad always said, if you're not scared when you go into battle, you're either a liar or a fool. And I think that's true from all the soldiers I've talked to. So my grandfather was very successful. He kind of died at the right time, if you will. He was set aside like a lot of these warriors are at the end of, even Churchill was, believe it or not, at the Potsdam Conference, when they were determining how to break up Europe. He was removed. He was voted out of office in the middle of the conference. He left the next day. Another guy came, Clement Attlee. So a lot of times they set these wartime president people aside. And so, but my grandfather, the day before he was coming home, about 4 or 5 months after the end of the war, he got in a strange car accident. It was a 20 mile an hour drunken army truck driver, and he was the only guy hurt. Wasn't a conspiracy. But then my dad, so when he got hurt, it's like December 9th, 1945. My dad was in exams at that point, and it was when he was hurt. Then two weeks later, on the 21st, he died. And my grandmother didn't let my dad come over and didn't let him come to the funeral. And she said it was because he was in exams. I think it was partly because she wanted the time with my grandfather. He was buried in Luxembourg, in an American military cemetery in Luxembourg. And 6 months later, if you can relate to this, my dad goes through graduation. There are a bunch of veterans there that wanted to see graduation, and some West Pointers and stuff. My dad goes through graduation, and he's walking in his uniform, and everybody pretty much knows who he is by that point. And this veteran who worked under my grandfather, served under my grandfather, comes up to him and says, "You'll never be the half the man your father was, but congratulations anyway." You know, I mean, imagine that happening on the first day of your career. And so he went on to become something like in the 20th or 25th, one of the most decorated soldiers in Vietnam. And for the most part, his combat time was spent as a regimental commander in a helicopter. So he would drop himself out of, into a battle when he saw that the ball wasn't moving forward. And he was tough, but what I take away is my grandfather's number one characteristic was bumptious self-confidence. And my dad's was reliability. And a lot of the guys that worked for him said he could have just been a truck driver and he would have been just as happy. And so they both had something, what they termed visible personality, where they would again drop into an LZ or a hot LZ or a combat situation when the soldiers needed that. And Horatio Nelson was the same way. Halsey, a lot of the great warriors were that way. McChrystal. And so that was the greatest thing I took away. And I think well, not really. I think the most important one that I've translated into civilian life, and I don't run GE or anything. I have three little ventures I'm doing, but was top-down loyalty. And I'm sure I've had a number of soldiers that have experienced the fact their bosses don't give a shit about them and they don't look out for them. My dad, that was all he thought about is what do I do for these soldiers? When he came back from Vietnam, and he commanded the Black Horse Regiment, 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, which is now the OP 4 at Fort Irwin in California. And so, but it was at Boulder Gap for a long time. Obviously, it was one of the most successful regiments in Vietnam. But when he came back, he and his chopper pal, the guy I write about in my book in the last chapter, they started a scholarship fund for lost warriors. And this was the way he thought. And I think this is a very rare thing in both, I don't know about military life, but certainly in civilian life in the companies I worked for, bottom up loyalty is required, and the military doesn't work unless you do what your boss says you do, if he's principled. But top down loyalty is really not, and I've experienced that a lot in my life. So those are some of the things I learned. One very funny incident, you guys know the couple of funny incidents. Well, let me tell you one that's yeah. When the movie Patton came out, George C. Scott came over to our house. And again, I don't remember if I remember it actually or remember it from the home movies we invariably took. But I recall him coming into our house. We were in Fort Knox. My dad was a deputy armored school commander and in Kentucky. And he came in, and my family did not want to be involved in the film. None of my dad's siblings or my dad's living sibling didn't want to be because they felt like nobody could capture the nuances of who General Patton was. And it turns out it was a pretty good film. Although if I'd been the director, I probably wouldn't have hired Bradley to be the principal advisor because they didn't really get along at the end of the war. But anyway, so he came over to our house. He had the film on the reels, 16 millimeter reels, came over. He's a really tall guy. And he walks in and George C. Scott was a bit of a lush, he did a little bit of drinking. So he comes in and he goes, "How are you, General Patton?" Or "How are you, Mr. Scott?" And he says, "Call me George." And he says, "My dad says you want a drink." He said, yeah. He said, "Where's your bar?" He said, "Yeah, I'll take a drink." So he goes over, my dad goes over to the bar, and my mom was always frustrated because she hated having a bar within view of everything. She just didn't think it was cool. But there's the bar in the corner. My dad goes over and makes him, he says, "What would you like?" "Bloody Mary." So he goes over and, pours the ice in and a little bit of vodka, a couple fingers of vodka, then all the tomato juice and some whatever Tabasco. Gives it to George C. Scott. He takes a big sip and he spits it out. He's like, God damn it, what the hell is this thing? And he says, Where's your bar? He goes over to the bar and he says, You got a quarter? And my dad gives him a quarter. So he puts a quarter in the highball glass. And then he fills it. Then he puts a couple pieces of ice in it. Then he fills it to about a half an inch from the top with vodka. And then he pours a little tomato juice in there. It looks like pink lemonade. He's like, now that's a Bloody Mary. So you guys can tell that story. But those are kind of the fun things. And let me tell you one more that relates to the top-down loyalty thing. I remember when we were about 10 and my dad was commander of the 2nd Armored Division, which they cased the colors, I don't know, 20 years ago after Desert Storm, I think. And so he would wake me up at 6 in the morning and he would take me to, there were like 5 or 6 mess halls at Fort Hood, and he would take me to different mess halls at least once a week. We get in there at 6 in the morning. It was a total pain in the neck because he flipped the lights on before he said, wake up. Are you awake? The lights go on. So we get up 6 in the morning, go to the mess halls. He'd get right in line, the grits, the SOS, the scrapple, whatever, and scrambled eggs. And we walk through the line. And at first, he would, they were scared to death. They're like, oh my God, it's General Patton. Then when they saw he was doing it regularly, they started to really appreciate it. And he would always sit with the NCOs and the enlisted. And it was just the way he was. Another thing, very similar, and I don't know if this is boring you, but very similar. Yeah, if you're finished with this talk before I do, you're free to leave, but hopefully you'll stay. So another thing he did is every week he'd have his chief of staff, this guy named Maupin. He was very Colonel Maupin. Now he was kind of a mentor to me. He would he would pick out some places, like maybe 3 or 4 places that were off base apartments where some of his soldiers lived. And he would take a trip out there with my mom, and he'd take, go down to Killeen, Texas, which he used to call Unclean, Texas. And he would check out these apartments, and he'd go in and say, hey, specialist so and so, would you? How's it going? How's the house? How's the apartment? Da, da, da. My mom, meanwhile, would go off and talk to the wife about her kids and everything. And the guy would say, well, it's pretty good, but the heat doesn't work, or this burner on the stove, I've been trying to get it fixed for a month, and the super never comes over. So then my dad would go back to his office, and the next day, his chief of staff would put phone numbers of all the superintendents of those tenements or whatever, those apartments. And he would call him up and he'd say, you get that thing fixed by 1600 hours or I'm going to be after you, stuff like that. And then the last story I'll tell you, which you can find if you go up to my audiobook, there's a cool couple good speeches. There's the State of the Division speech he gives, which is pretty long. There's a speech he gave the night before commencement to the graduating class of 1976, which is McChrystal's class. And I've spoken to him, and he's was pretty excited that he was able to listen to that speech 40 years later, 50 years later. But that was pretty cool. But there's another one up there that is an interview with my dad at Fort Hood, and I call it the White Stars interview. My dad always, whenever he could get them, he would wear white insignia. After he could have them made himself, he'd try to wear silver, and he'd wear like a metal, eagle on his helmet when he was a colonel in Vietnam. But he would always wear white insignia when he was a general. And this civilian reporter, and it's on my audiobook, would say, General, why do you wear white stars? And he said, well, so that when I see a soldier that's not wearing his uniform properly, I need to stop the Jeep and address the situation. I want to know who I am. He said, but more importantly, he said, I want the enemy to see me. I want to be a target for the enemy. And she's kind of freaked out. She's a local news reporter. And then she says, why is that? Isn't it dangerous? Yeah, it's dangerous. And we're a long time dead. He said, but I want the enemy to know that I know that, no, I want the enemy to know that I have a certain disdain for their accuracy of fire. This is the kind of thing my dad would say. And on the one hand, it was persona. He was saying these things to get a rise, but they were also true. That is why he wore it. So anyway, lots of other stories. You can read a bunch of them in my book, Growing Up Patton, or listen to the audiobook. But anyway, I can leave it there unless you have a couple questions. I hope this has been moderately interesting.
Yeah, no, this has been great. It's funny. The White Stars makes me think of another Vietnam vet, Carlos Hathcock. If you're aware of, he used to wear a white feather. He was probably he's one of the great snipers of the Marine Corps. And, he had that same disdain for the Vietnamese. But Victor, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thanks again for sharing.
Hold on, let me interrupt you. No sirs. You got everybody in this call outranks me, so none of that. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah,
In fact,
I'm
my
just.
name as a kid was goddamn it Ben. So if you want to call me that, I'm trying to get my son to call me "Oh Captain, my Captain" from the famous Walt Whitman poem about
Yeah.
Lincoln, but I just can't pull that off. My dog's the only one that listens to me. But go ahead. I'm just
All
Ben.
right. No, sorry, man. I guess I'm institutionalized. I call sir.
That's yeah, like Red and Shawshank Redemption, right? I'm an
Yeah, yeah,
institutional man. Yeah, well, that's not
absolutely.
a good thing. So just go with
Yeah,
Ben.
but I was just saying thanks for sharing great stories. I was just wondering any insights because I know once he was your grandfather, uh, legend that he is, when he was alive, he was also attacked very thoroughly. I don't know about media, politicians, because he was a warrior through and through. He was not into the politics. Did that affected the family? You know, there was a concerted effort when he, slapped the soldier. He got sense into him. All those stories. I was wondering if would that affected you guys? Did you experience that? Your father tells anything about those?
Well, I mean, look, they were both equal opportunity offenders, and my dad had a similar incident where a lieutenant who was in a foxhole at the front line in Vietnam had left his post, and my dad went back and pulled a weapon on him and said, "Dude, I'm gonna get you tried," and blah 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 blah, and said these things, and so they both came up against it. My dad did a few things, that he got in trouble for, and my grandfather, I gotta say, he was great. But he was flawed, and had he not slapped a soldier, he would have been commanding Normandy. I mean, that was the big. His biographer said that was the most significant thing in the not relating to Russia, but in the American, campaign against the Germans was the slapping of the soldier because two soldiers because he ended up switching roles with Bradley, and he became a deputy to Bradley, and he didn't command the army group, he commanded the army, and he didn't like that because Bradley was an infantryman, and he'd been sort of a mentor to Eisenhower and Bradley, and Bradley, yeah, Bradley didn't have any experience except under my grandfather with amphibious landings. My grandfather was a sailor. He sailed across the Pacific twice, taught himself to celestial navigate. And he'd done amphibious landings, multiple in Morocco, in Sicily, both strategically and tactically. And so he was frustrated to be taken out of the planning entirely. But did it affect me? No. I mean, most people think it's pretty cool, Patton. Think it's pretty cool. But a few people come up and say, your grandfather, he had 10,000 pages of letters and diaries. And somewhere in there, they found a few pages where he said something about Jews and he said something about Arabs, but ultimately both of them were about the man, and I think, in fact, I'll give you one last story. This may be off subject, but my brother and I gave a talk years ago. He's a wonderful writer. He wrote a book that goes back to Scotland in 1746, where my ancestors were all criminals and they made good when they came over. And and this woman it's called The Pattons. We're making a film about it, actually. We're working with a big production company on a feature film about kind of young Patton. So this woman comes up to the podium and she's got a tattoo on her, the numbers on her arm. She's Jewish. It was a Jewish breakfast, actually. And somebody had asked him, how, was your grandfather anti-Semitic? And he said, I don't. He said some things. He had a lot of papers. He had a lot of paper trail, but he said he was ultimately about the man, like I said. And the woman came up to him and said, whatever his personal views were, I don't care. But if Eisenhower had let him do what he wanted to do during 1944 and 45, there'd be a lot more of my brethren here, and I think that was, do as I do, not as I say. So it didn't really affect us. I love being his grandson, but I have many other people that I look to in my family. My mother, a biography is being written about her by a close friend of the family right now. And, she has a much longer history in the military than my dad does. It goes back to 1812, all graduates at West Point through her brother. So before Patton came along, they were pretty famous. So yeah, it didn't affect anything. If we have time, I'll take another question.
Hey, Jim, you got the last one, sir?
Hey, Ben, it's pretty neat opportunity to hear you speak. I'm over here in Germany, and I actually was just up at the cemetery this past weekend. I took my son, 19-year-old son, to Bastogne. We went to the museums and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool to have you on this week. My question is to you: how often do you get to come back over here and visit and get to.
Well, back over here being where?
Yeah, I'm currently in Germany right now, but like, how often do you get to come back over to Europe or visit your grandfather's gravesite and stuff
Well, I
like
was
that?
there in October because they had the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Luxembourg and Belgium. Took my son because again, I come back to a quote by a guy named George Santayana long before my grandfather took credit for it, that if you don't learn your history, you're destined to repeat it. You're the tough history. So I make it a point to come back. We also went to Normandy on D-Day a few years ago. So I don't I'd like to, in fact I'd like to move to Luxembourg, would be great, but I lived 3 times in Germany. I've been there a bunch of other times. I speak working knowledge of German. And here's a story that you will read in my book. But the mayor of Stuttgart, which is one of the largest cities in Germany, the mayor for my whole childhood for about 22 years was Manfred Rommel, who's the son of Erwin Rommel, the great field marshal who ended up having to commit suicide because because he was implicated in the plot to kill Hitler in
Valkyrie.
Valkyrie, basically, yeah. And so during that period, I think it was April 20th, 1944, 44. And he had been shot by a British Spitfire in his command car around Normandy because he was in charge of the defense of Normandy. So he was actually under, with a cracked skull when the bomb plot happened. But then he goes home and he was, implicated. So he was forced to take a cyanide pill. And but Manfred Rommel was the mayor of Stuttgart for 22 years. I remember he told me, the first time I won because of my father, the second time because of me. He could have run for chancellor any time, but he just loved being a mayor because he said national politics is like an opera house. Everybody wants to be heard. Municipal level, we want to solve problems. So it was great. We would go over to their house every Christmas Eve, and he would trade memorabilia with my dad because their birthdays were both on Christmas Eve. It was so cool just to watch these guys. I tried to make a film about them called Sons of History, but they were both had Parkinson's, and I just couldn't get either one of them on a plane. So didn't ever quite come to fruition. But he's a lovely, lovely guy. And I've written about him. A few months ago, I wrote a couple posts about him on LinkedIn, so you can go back and find some of those. And you'll find some great stories. But anyway, well, look, I've really enjoyed this. I'm just a lowly civilian, but I'd love for you to take a look at the Substack and subscribe. Go to our website. I won't pepper you with too many things, but I only put good stuff up there. And if you're ever interested in doing one of our workshops, like I said, right now we have a couple, one in this coming weekend. We have a few spots available. If you can get yourself to Denver Airport, we'll take care of everything else. And I'll probably get an Uber. I'll put you up, because this is a special group. We have another one in Colorado Springs in May. We've got one in Oregon one in Colorado Springs in June, and then one in May in Oregon. And we're just trying to raise more money. And I think if anybody wants to go to Ukraine, I think by October, November, we'll be doing a bunch of workshops in Ukraine. So thank you very much. It's been an honor. And again, I'd love to connect with any of you. If you find me on LinkedIn or Ernie can give you my email, it's fine. Go to Patton Vets or go to LinkedIn and find me and we'll connect. And if anybody live anywhere in New York, I'll take you to lunch.
On my way. It'll be dinner this time. But hey, Benjamin Patton, Patton Veterans Project, and you're also opening a Patton's Distillery.
Oh yeah, I just decided it's a terrible time to pursue a bourbon, but a friend of mine and I did an investment in some barrels of bourbon and rye, and we thought, well, one way to sell them is why don't we create Patton spirits? And it's kind of like with our workshops, we're going to get you all activated, rekindle, going back into your history. And then we're going to calm you down at the end and get you help. It's kind of weird. But here it's like, yeah, we're going to get you to drink a little bit. And then we're going to, then we're going to send you to AA or something. But it's kind of cool. There'll be a lot of memorabilia. I'm trying to get into the PXs and stuff. So it's pattonspirits.com if you want to take a look. There's a few pictures of my grandfather up there too. So once again, thanks so much. I'm happy to connect with any of you. And you can find a lot more about me on those areas. And we'll talk soon. And there's also a lot of press up on the pattonvets.org site.
Awesome.
All right.
Hey,
well, thanks very much.
again,
Have a great
Benjamin.
Friday and stay in touch. I'm happy to talk to any one of you anytime.
Yeah. You're welcome back, sir. In the meantime, you have a great weekend, and I look forward to chatting.